Chinese Civil War Armies 1911 for 9A. NTRO. DUCTON. For almost the whole of this period there was fighting somewhere in China, and armies, some millions strong, battled for control of this vast country. There were many different forces involved in these conflicts, and this book hopes to describe them in as much detail as possible. Chronology 1908 November Death of Guangxu Emperor, Boy Emperor Pu Yanfriend. February Sun resigns and Yuan Shikai, the strongest military leader, becomes new president. 1913 The Second Revolution, attempted rebellion Bisan Yat-sen's forces against Yuan Shikai's government fails. 1915 December Yuan makes himself emperor but throughout China faces revolts against his plans. Yuan dies, power is now in the hands of provincialiators, warlords, who rule their own areas. Warlord period begins 1917 June failed attempt at imperial restoration by pigtailed army. August China declares war on Germany. September Sun Yat-sen forms government in South China at Canton. 1920 Summer war between Anfu clique of warlords and Chile clique. 1922 war between Chile clique and Fengtian clique. 1923 October Soviet advisors arrive in Canton to help Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang party to form their own army. 1924 Second Chile-Fengtian War, Wempol Military Academy formed to train officers for the Kuomintang Army. 1925 March Death of Sun Yat-sen. 19-6 June Start of Kuomintang's northern expedition to defeat all warlord armies and unite China under own government. September Northern expedition takes the city of Wuhan. November Northern expedition takes the city of Nanjing. 19-7 March Northern expedition takes Nanking and Shanghai. April Kuomintang turn against their communist allies and massacre many. August mutiny of 24th Division of 11th Nationalist Army leads to the forming of the first communist unit under Chu Ti. September Harvest rebellion led by communist Mao Zedong fails. 1928 June last major warlord, Chiang Solin, is blown upon a train by his Japanese sponsors as he retrietsto his Manchurian stronghold. Warlord period ends 1929-30 Chiang Kai-shek consolidates his power by defeating opposition from Guangxi generals and the Christian warlord Feng Yuxiang. 1930 October 1st encirclement campaign by the Nationalists against Guangxi Soviet fails. 1931 April 2nd encirclement campaign. July 3rd encirclement campaign. September Japanese invade Manchuria. 1930 to January Japanese proclaim the new state of Manchukuo Manchuria, with last emperor of China, Hu Yi, as head of state. January-May Shanghai incident, Japanese attack the city and are held off by 19th Route Army. 1933 January-March Japanese invade Johor province in northeast China. April 4th encirclement campaign. December 5th encirclement campaign is successful. Communists in danger. 1934 October encircled communists move out of their base and begin long march. -100,000 people begin march. 1935 October communists reach new base in Yan'an, Shensi province. Only 10,000 people are left, the rest have been lost through death or desertion. 1936 December Shanxi incident, Chiang Kai-shek kidnapped while in Shanxi and forced to agree to a united front with the communists to fight the Japanese invaders instead of each other. 1937 July Marco Polo Bridge incident, Japanese use Aklesh on the border as an excuse to invade the rest of China and almost immediately capture Peking. November Japanese take Shanghai after hard fighting. December puppet provisional government formed in Peking, Nanking, capital of nationalist China, falls and Japanese kill thousands of Chinese in rape of Nanking. 1938 March puppet reformed government established in Nanking, Japanese army defeated in battle off Tarquang. October Japanese take Canton, nationalist government moves to Chongqing. 1939 March Japanese take Nanchang. 1940 March Wan Qingwei forms puppet reorganized government in Nanking. This becomes the puppet government for all occupied China. August, Communist 100 Regiments campaign September defeated. 1941 January New Fourth Army Incident. Nationalists turn on their communist allies and try to destroy communist units under their command. This leads to the unofficial end of the United Front against Japan. 1940 to 43rds. Stalemate in China as Japan withdraws troops for Uzan conquests in Southeast Asia, and nationalists and communists prepare for expected civil war. 1940 for June-October Japanese Ichigo offensive. Large areas of nationalists held China conquered. 1945 September Japanese surrender. Nationalists with U.S. help move into Japanese-held territory. Communists with Soviet help move into Manchuria and Mackite their stronghold. 1946 May nationalists move into Manchuria. July heavy fighting begins in civil war. November communist victory at Battle of Shichiakwang. 1948 March communists take Jilin. Battle of Luoyang. May Battle of Kaifeng ends in stalemate. September Battle of Jinan. Final communist assault in Manchuria. October Battle of Huaihai. Nationalists lose 500,000 men. 1949 January Peking surrenders. April Nanking falls. May Shanghai falls. September Chiang Kai-shek flees to the island of Taiwan with his government. October People's Republic of China established. The 1911 revolution. Manchu Dynasty had been in decline for many years and had faced many rebellions in the 19th century which it had managed to quell. With the accession of the 2-year-old Puyi as emperor, in 1908, its days were numbered. A mutiny of the imperial army garrison at Wuchang soon escalated into all-out rebellion, and when the commander of the main imperial army, Yuan Shikai, came out in favor of a new constitutional monarchy, the days of the emperor holding real power in China were over. Because the idea of a monarchy was so deep-seated in the minds of Chinese people, the new government allowed the emperor to continue to live in the Forbidden City as a figurehead. The reality of their evolution was that power had now passed to the military men who had kept the emperor in power. The Imperial Army, Chinese army up to 1911 was a mixture of old and new, with some parts of the army dressed in the Western style and using the latest weaponry and other units looking like something out of the Middle Ages. With the defeat of the Chinese army in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and the Boxer Rebellion in 1901, many Chinese militarists realized that the army had to modernize quickly or face further defeats and humiliations. Individual commanders were given permission to set up modern armies, and these varied greatly since there was no central control over their development. By 1911, when the army at Wuchang rebelled against the Manchu dynasty, the Imperial Army had approximately 200,000 men in these modernized armies, which were known as Luchan. Besides these well-equipped troops, there were about 270,000 provincial troops, who were poorly trained and equipped, and about 55,000 Green Standard militia. Unfortunately for the imperialists, it was the modernized armies which rebelled, and the poorer troops of provincial and Green Standard militias that stayed loyal to the dynasty. Imperial Army uniforms from 1910. The soldiers of the Imperial Chinese Army were dressed in a new westernized uniform which had winter and summer versions. Winter uniforms were in dark blue with branch color facings on the peak cap, shoulder bars, and sleeve stripes. Trousers were quite baggy, and tucked into white gaiters which fastened with small buttons downside, and had a strap that went under the shoe. Rank was shown by the number of black stripes around the cap and then UMBR of branch. Color stripes on the arm of jacket: 1 for a private, 2 for a corporal and 3 for a sergeant. Cap badges were a gold disc with a dragon design for ordinary soldiers. For officers there was a stone in center. These stones came in 3 colors: red for high ranks, blue for middle ranks, and white for lower ranks. Officers' winter service uniforms had a stripe in branch color around the lower sleeve. Above this 1, 2 or 3 black stripes indicated rank, and above these 1, 2 or 3 gold discs showed the grade of rank. The officers' caps had no branch colors around them but had between only and 3 black stripes around the band. The grade of the rank was denoted by an 2 or 3 vertical stripes at the side. Officers' parade uniforms consisted of a dark blue frock coat with an Austrian knot on the sleeve and gold or silver gold for combat units, infantry, cavalry and so on, and silver for administration and support staff. Officer scholars had a design of a dragon with a stone in its mouth on each side, with color of the stone matching the color of the stone on the cap badge. or on the top and front of the collar was gold or silver braid, with the number of bands between 1 and 3 indicating the rank. The 9 grades of ranks on collars went from 1 line of braid with a white stone in the dragon's mouth for the rank of lieutenant to 3 lines of braid with a red stone in the dragon's mouth for a general. Officers' caps had a number of gold or silver stripes around the band and gold stripes vertically at the side to indicate rank and grade respectively. Epaulets were woven gold or silver cord. Rank was shown by thieving of the cord. Lower ranks had red edging and gold and silver centers. Middle ranks had gold or silver edging and red centers, and the highest ranks had solid gold and silver cord. Grades of ranks were shown be 1, 2 or 3 gold or silver buttons on top of the epaulets. Summer uniforms were in a light khaki cotton in the same style as the winter uniform but in a lighter material. For lower-ranking soldiers, the ranks on the summer uniforms were shown by black chevrons on the upper right arm. The Imperial Guard Division was formed in 1908 and recruited exclusively from monks until 1910, when recruits were accepted from all parts of China. Guards wore a different uniform from the rest of the army. It was gray, with the same branch colors and red piping around the top of the peaked cap. Officers wore shoulder boards of woven silver cord similar to those on the dress uniform. According to the 1910 regulations, the gendarmerie, or military police, wore a distinct uniform in blue-gray with red facings and a hat which was a gray shako with red band and a black leather peak. Both winter and summer uniforms were worn by imperialist troops during the fighting in 1911-12, and the majority of soldiers had been issued with the 1910 regulation uniform by the time fighting broke out. The provincial and green standard troops, who were the second linean militia soldiers of the Imperial Army, wore old and obsolete uniforms. Many of them still had ribbons, as worn by the army in the 19th century. These units were soon to be disbanded, so no new supplies of uniform or equipment would have been issued to them. The Republican Army or Republican uniforms during the Revolution. The Republicans had approximately 800,000 men under arms, and the majority of these were volunteers who returned home after the emperor abdicated. Many of the revolutionaries were mutinous soldiers, and they would have worn their imperial uniforms, often without bothering to remove their old insignia. They also wore armbands to distinguish them from the imperialists. One eyewitness described them as wearing a black cotton uniform with a white band round the peaked cap, white or gray puttees or long trousers. Many of revolutionaries were students or military cadets, and they would have worn their university uniforms. Others are described as having worn semi-civilian dress, which suggests that it was at least in some part military. The rebels were also often distinguished by the large canvas cartridge belts they wore, which would have been manufactured locally. For a few years after the revolution, until the issue of new dress regulations in 1914, the uniforms of the Republic went through a number of changes. 2 new forms of cap badge were worn, each for a short period. One was a plain gold 5-pointed star. The other was based on flag of the revolution, the Chiang flag, named after the city where the revolution had broken out. In the center of the flag was a symbol made up of a circle of 9 discs, each with a ray coming out from it, and on the end of each ray another disc. The badge was a silver version of this. These badges were never universally adopted. The next national cap badge was the 5-colored star that was adopted as the Army cap badge in 1914. The Warlords warled conflicts during the period 1916 to 1928. Provincial governors, or tuckins, fought for power in a dividend China. With no strong central government, various military strongmen, warlords, have tried to build up power bases, forming alliances or cliques with the aim of eventually controlling all China. When warlords made alliances with each other, they could sometimes put up to 500,000 men in the field at a time. Warlords would try to lend some legitimacy to their regimes by capturing Peking and forming a government there. However, these military dictatorships were usually short-lived. The next set of warlords would soon move in to take their place. Disputes between warlords might be settled by payment of bribes, and one army might make a strategic retreat if the commanding warlord was paid enough. Warlords were often aware that their career could be cut short, and they might have to make a dash for the nearest foreign concession. Their wise warlord could live out his retirement in luxury on the proceeds of his ill-gotten gains. Indeed, at one time there were nearly 100 retired warlords in the city of Shenzhen alone. Principal Warlord Shan Tsu and Chiang 1881–1932, Dogmeat General. An extremely brutal warlord who ruled Shantung Province for a few years. Chiang Solin 1873–1928, Tiger of the North, leader of Fengtian clique. He controlled Manchuria for many years, until he was defeated in 1928. Wu Peifu 1874–1939, Jade Marshal, leader of Chile clique. Any of the best military brains in China, the main adversary for Chiang Solin. Yan Shishen 1883–1960, model governor, ruler of Shanxi province from 1912 to 1949, and the greatest survivor among warlords. Feng Yuxiang 1880–1948, Christian warlord, leader of Kuomintang clique. A colorful character who was a converted Baptist and baptized his men with a hosepipe. Sun Chuanfang 1885–1935, Nanking warlord, leader League of Five Provinces. Powerful warlord of eastern China. Warlord armies were the armies of Tukkens, who controlled China for over 10 years, from 1916 to 1928. This period is often called the era of high warlordism, when warlords were at their most powerful and central government was at its weakest. Fighting between the various warlords went on all the time. One or other would gain the upper hand, but none of them ever gained full control of China. The armies that the warlords used in these conflicts varied greatly in quality and quantity, from armed rabble-only good forth slaughter of innocent peasants to well-dressed, well-trained, well-equipped and disciplined armies. According to Western observers, the best of the warlords' troops compared quite favorably with European armies of the time. All warlords had elite units which were always in the thick of the action, and many had so-called dare-to-die units which were virtual suicide squads, who would be thrown against their enemies in attacks from which few returned. One Fengtian unit lost 5,000 men in a single attack. Soldiers of this caliber were in the minority. The vast majority did not receive the training or the equipment necessary to create a professional force. They were mere cannon fodder. Men joined the army to survive and to fend off hunger, and their loyalty was to whoever kept them fed and clothed. Ordinary soldiers were despised by the rest of Chinese society and seen as the lowest of the low. This view of the Chinese military by the people was made worse by the fact that there were so many armies roaming around China at that time, helping themselves to whatever they wanted, be it livestock to eat or farmers' sons as pressed recruits. Not all warlords and their armies were so bad. Some more enlightened commanders looked after their soldiers' welfare and insisted that their armies pay for goods they took from the people. Others tried to improve their army's military capabilities with good training, imported European arms and foreign instructors. Modern war methods were used by one warlord or the other, with armored trains, tanks and armored cars all in use in the fighting in the 1920s. Chiang Solin had Renault FT-17 light tanks, and his rival, Wu Peifu, had Citroën Kegres half-track armored cars. The most powerful warlords even had quite large air forces. Chiang Solin's had almost 100 aircraft of the latest types, including Brigade 14 light bombers. Just about every kind of rifle and machine gun available was also used, and some weapons were manufactured in arsenals set up by the warlords. Machine guns were highly prized, since until the mid-1920s there were only about 1,000 in total in China. The many kinds of weapon in use in one army made it very difficult for supply officers to provide their units with ammunition. As a result, most soldiers would have had only a few rounds. Artillery was always in short supply, and most field guns were of small caliber, often mountain guns, which were easier to handle. To make up for the lack of field artillery, many warlord armies used mortars of the Stokes design, and these were produced in some quite large calibers, up to 8 inches. Artillery caused relatively few casualties and does not seem to have been effectively used by warlord armies. There is no way that the average warlord army could be described as an efficient fighting machine. Until the Northern Expedition of 1926, all warlord army had to fight were other warlord armies against the better disciplined and motivated nationalists in the fighting in 1926-28. They were usually quickly defeated. White Russians in warlord armies. Quite a few warlords employed White Russian refugees to fight, and their combat experience was put to good use. Chiang Tsung-shang, the Dogmeat General, was one of the main recruiters of White Russians, with up to 4,600 in his army. He used them to crew armored trains, which were a major weapon in the warlord's armory. Chiang also had a so-called Foreign Legion made up of 700 White Russians, 300 Japan assigned to Chinese companies. The Manchurian warlord Chiang So-lin also used White Russians and had a unit known as the Mukden Lancers in his army. They wore a special uniform in dark green with yellow leather boots and were armed with a lance, a Mauser pistol and a petting sword. Apart from elite units such as this, most White Russians wore the same uniform as their Chinese comrades. Warlord uniform Sino uniform was introduced for the army in 1914, and this became the basis for uniforms worn through the Warlord period. It consisted of a gray-green cotton uniform with a peaked cap which had a 5-colored star on. Branch colors were shown in the band of the cap and in the collar patches and shoulder bars. Ranks were indicated by the number of silver or gold stars on these shoulder bars, 1 for a private, 2 for a private 1st class and 3 for a lance corporal. The higher ranks had a gold stripe down the center of the bar. On these, 1 star was for corporal, 2 for sergeant and 3 for staff sergeant. For officers there were 3 stripes on the bar in silver and gold. For lower-ranking officers the 2 outer stripes were silver and the center 1 gold. On these bars there was 1 star for second lieutenant, 2 for lieutenant, and 3 for captain. The next ranks up had 2 gold outer stripes and a silver centre 1, with 1 star for major, 2 for lieutenant colonel and 3 for colonel. For the highest-ranking officers the shoulder bars were all gold, with 1 star for major general, 2 for lieutenant general and 3 for general. See table 2. Officers' ranks could also be shown by the number of red stripes down the trousers, 1 for a company officer, 2 for a regimental or battalion officer and 3 for a general officer. Unit numbers were shown on the collar patches, using a confusing system of Roman, Arabic and Chinese numerals. The soldier's battalion number was shown on the left collar patch with Roman numerals, and his regiment on the left collar with Arabic numerals. The individual soldier's number was shown on the right collar patch, using Chinese characters. When these numbers were worn they were not always complete, and in the confused situation among Chinese armies of that time only the best organized units would have had them. By the early 1920s the warlord armies were wearing a variety of uniforms, all based loosely on the 1914 uniform. Northern soldiers wore a padded cotton jacket and trousers which were usually gray or gray-green. Thick woolen gray puttees were worn up to the knees to keep the soldiers warm in the bitter climate of northern China and Manchuria. Northern headgear was either a fur hat with ear flaps that could be worn up or down, or a peaked cotton cap which had a smaller crown than type worn in the rest of China. Southern soldiers wore a lighter cotton uniform in light khaki or gray, with a cotton peaked cap which bore a 5-colored star badge. Trousers were often worn without puttees, and straw sandals were worn because of a shortage of good shoes. The soldiers of the southern warlord armies were generally more poorly equipped for colder climates, and when campaigning in winter suffered greatly because of this. Shoes were one of a warlord soldier's greatest problems. The canvas hose worn by most soon wore out on the march or disintegrated in few. Soldiers would often buy their own shoes from markets or simply take them from the long-suffering peasantry. A soldier's kit would be pretty basic, and although some troops had backpacks, most had to deal with a haversack or bundle, which was worn across the shoulder. One item of kit often used by the warlord soldier was an umbrella, which was very useful for sheltering from both sun and rain. While most warlords were intent on carving out as much territory as possible for themselves, officially they were loyal to the central government in Peking. So no warlord dressed his army in non-government uniforms, and no warlord raised his own flag over the territory he controlled. All fought, at least officially, under the flag of the Republic. This meant that when two opposing armies met on the battlefield, they were often wearing the same uniform, so field signs had to be worn to distinguish friend from foe. The usual form of field sign was an armband, worn on the upper left arm. The armbands were usually made from linen and were either red, blue, green or white. Often the armband would have the name of the commanding officer stitched onto it in white or, in the case of white armbands, black characters. Others had the name of the relevant army, such as the National Pacification Army of Chiang So-lin. Still others had white discs on a colored background with black Chinese characters in the center. Armbands could easily be replaced in battle, allowing units to change sides in the middle of an engagement if their unit commander decided to betray his commanding general. Local changes were sometimes made to headgear. For example, in the Chile army some of these soldiers tied scarves around their peak caps. Due to shortages of official headgear, improvisation was also necessary, as in the army of the Warlord Sun Chuan Fang, which in 1927 wore alkali produced felt hat which can only be described as of Robin Hood style, with the sides folded up and fastened high at the back. These soldiers of the Christian warlord Feng Yuxiang wore a summer sun hat of gray cotton, which resembled a bathing cap and had a 4 inches brim. None of these forms of headgear would have protected the soldier shed, but as with all other types of equipment, steel helmets were in short supply and were a rarity in warlord units. The only unit known to have worn them was part of Wu Peifu's 3rd Division, which became known as the Tin Hat Brigade. Chiang Soon-shang did receive a shipment of arms in 1928 which included steel helmets, but it is doubtful that they reached his army before his defeat. Warlords and high-ranking officers were smartened up versions of the ordinary soldier's uniform in the field, but their dress uniform was much grander. Officers' dress uniform was light blue and was worn with a kepi-style hat which had a white plume. There was gold decoration around the kepi and on the collar and cuffs, and the gold epaulettes had a fringe. Epaulettes also had a system of stars to denote rank. Other details varied, and warlords would often compete to see who could wear the most gold and the most awards and medals on their chests. They awarded themselves honors and medals, usually with their own face adorning them, and they handed these out to their officers and to other friendly warlords. This led to some warlords looking like strutting peacocks, with their feathers, sashes, and gold decorations. However, some went to other extremes. The Christian warlord Feng Yuxiang liked to dress as scruffily as possible in order to feel as one with his troops. He was described as looking like a rough farm boy. Organisation. The unit organization of the Imperial, Republican, and Nationalist armies was basically the same up to divisional level. The strength of divisions was slightly different, the Imperial Division having a full strength of 12,368 men, the Republican Division 12,512 men and the Nationalist Division 10,923 men. In the British Army the next level above division would be the corps. This did not exist in China's armies of this period. In its place were 2 levels of army, the Field Army and the Group Army. The Field Army consisted of 2 divisions, and the Group Army consisted of 3 field armies. Thus an average Group Army had a strength of 60,000 to 80,000 men, the same as a British Army. The Communists in the 1920s and 1930s had little or no unit structure. Their main armies were the 8th Route Army and the New Fourth Army. The former went from 80,000 in 1937 to 550,000 in 1944, and the latter went from 12,000 in 1937 to 294,000. With the rapid expansion of the Communist forces during the Civil War, after 1946 the Communists adopted nationalist unit structure but with larger numbers per unit. In the Civil War a Communist battalion had 852 men, a regiment 3,242 men, and a division around 10,000. By 1949 the People's Liberation Army had 219 divisions and 73 armies, which were into 3 group armies. The Nationalist Army of China began life as the army of the Kuomintang political party founded by Yat-sen. Sun realized that the warlords would not relinquish power peacefully, and that the only way to achieve the democracy he wanted for China was by force. So he formed the Kuomintang Army in 1922 and set up a military academy at Whampoa, with Soviet instructors to train the officers. By making alliances with the local warlords around the Kuomintang base off Canton, the new army survived long enough to train for the coming northern expedition. When Sun Yat-sen died, in 1925, his successor Chiang Kai-shek continued to plan the Warlords of Eartha and finally launched the northern expedition in 1926. By 1928 the main warlords had been defeated, and Chiang set up a new government in Nanjing. The Kuomintang Army became the National Army of China. Nationalist uniforms 1920-28. The very earliest nationalist uniforms consisted of a loose-fitting cotton shirt and trousers with a canvas sun hat. Even for Chinese uniforms these were not very martial-looking, and as soon as better uniforms became available they were replaced. In 1922 a new uniform was designed for the Kuomintang Army. It was described in the press as the new uniform of warriors of Sun Yat-sen. It consisted of a cotton-peaked cap with a black band and the 5-colored star cap badge. The jacket was light khaki in color and had red collar and shoulder insignia with the same system of ranks as the other armies of China at the time. Light khaki shorts and black woolen puttees finished off the new uniform, which was available in limited numbers only. By the time of the Northern Expedition of 1926, the Nationalists were wearing their own uniform, made from light brown cotton with the Nationalists an emblem on the peaked cap. Trousers were worn with or without puttees. Riding breeches and leather gaiters were popular with officers. No rank distinctions were normally worn, although a few high-ranking officers did improvise by wearing Republican shoulder ranks in the left upper arm with a small Nationalist sun badge attached. The majority of early Nationalist uniforms had only a cotton name or unit patch above its left breast pocket, and the cap badge as insignia. Flags had a highly symbolic role in the Kuomintang armies of the Northern Expedition, and Nationalist sun flag of the party was always seen in battle. Even small squads of soldiers carried their own flags, which they would have hoisted to stir up revolutionary fervor in the men. As Warlord soldiers switched to the Nationalist side, they wore their old uniforms with the five-colored star removed and the Nationalist sun added. The constant fighting and confusion meant that any attempt at standardizing uniforms during this period was very difficult. It is rare to see soldiers of the early Nationalist army wearing exactly the same uniform. Nationalist uniforms 1928 for 5Y1930. The Nationalists' victory had brought about a certain amount of order to China, and this was reflected in the better dress of the bulk of the army. Rank insignia was introduced, which consisted of collar patches in the branch colors and a series of gold triangles from 1 for a private third class to 3 for a private first class. The next ranks up had a black line behind the triangles from 1 triangle for a corporal to 3 for a first sergeant. The next ranks up had a gold line behind the triangles from second lieutenant to captain, then to gold lines from major to colonel, and finally the highest ranks had a gold background with 1, 2 or 3 triangles going from Major General to General Suitable 3. In the early 1930s, the basic uniforms were worn by the rank and file of the Nationalist Army. The northern troops that first faced the invading Japanese wore gray PADD cotton uniforms with either fur hats, old-style peaked caps, or a field cap similar in shape to a French kepi. All hats had the Kuomintang emblem. The Southern Nationalist uniform became the standard uniform after the defeat of the Northern armies in the fighting against Japan in the early 1930s. There were 2 versions of the Southern uniform, summer and winter. The summer uniform consisted of a light cotton khaki jacket which went from light khaki in color to mid-brown, with many variations depending on local supplies. Jackets usually had 2 breast pockets and 2 waist pockets with 5 buttons down the front of the tunic and aston and full collar which carried the rank insignia. Above the left breast pocket was a unit patch which had a border in the branch color red for infantry and yellow for cavalry, etc. Trousers were either breeches or long shorts in cotton and were worn with woolen puttees that came up to the knees. Headgear was either a field cap of the ski type or a steel helmet, which came in various patterns. Winter uniforms were made of PADD or wadded cotton material and were blue-gray in color. They are usually described as blue uniforms should have faded, but this was not always the case. Some would have been made from gray material. The padded jacket and trousers gave the wearer a podgy and gainly look but were quite effective at keeping him warm. Steel helmets became more widely used during the 1930s, and by 1937 they were in quite widespread use in the Nationalist Army. Helmets came in a variety of types, including the German 1935 model, the French Adrian, and both British and American World War I models. 3 types of Chinese-produced helmets were also in use. 2 were based on early Japanese helmets, and 1 was a pith-type helmet similar to that worn by the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War. The German 1935 model helmet was the most widely worn model from the mid-1930s till 1949. They were still being worn in the Civil War event, though the American was the standard model by that time. French Adrian helmets were mostly worn by troops in the province bordering French Indochina and by the 19th Division, which was an American-trained division. All helmets had the Nationalist sun emblem on the left side of the helmet or on the front, and some of the French Adrian models had a badge on the front with the sun emblem in the center of a wreath. After the outbreak of World War II, Chiang's American allies began to supply the Nationalists large amounts of aid in the form of equipment and advisors. The Americans persuaded Chiang to send 20 divisions to India to be trained to fight in Burma on the Allied side. The troops were trained and equipped by the Americans and British, and wore a mixture of their cast-off uniforms with American ML or British helmets. When the Japanese were defeated, they were airlifted back to China to become a useful addition to the nationalist forces in the Civil War. The officer's service uniform was khaki, usually wool, and consisted of a field cap of the German ski type with the nationalist sun emblem. On the single-breasted jacket were two breast pockets and two waist pockets with the rank shown on the collar by the usual rank patches. Trousers were of a Western style, worn without puttees, although in the field, officers would often revert to their breeches and puttees. Air Force personnel were part of the Army and wore the same basic uniform as Army officers but with different rank insignia, worn on the collar and cuffs of the jacket. Air Force officers wore a peaked cap similar to the U.S. model, which was later adopted by Army officers as well. New dress uniforms were introduced for higher-ranking officers. They consisted of a dark blue jacket and trousers and kepi. The jacket had gold embroidery on the stiff collar and cuffs and gold epaulettes with fringes. There was also gold embroidery on the peak of the kepi, which had stripes of gold braid on the sides. The cap badge was a nationalist sun emblem with a floral wreath of very intricate design around it. Ranks were shown on the dress uniform by means of a series of gold rings, flower blossoms and stripes on the sleeve of the jacket. For example, for the rank of 1 grade high general, the sleeve had 3 gold stripes with 3 flower blossoms above and 2 gold rings above them. Officers also wore ceremonial daggers or dirks, which were similar to the type worn by the various German armed forces and political groups in the 1930s and 1940s. Nationalists versus Communists won 9-7 for 5. The alliance between the Nationalist Party and Communist Party in China was always fragile. Their joint hatred of the warlords the only thing that kept it together. When Chiang Kai-shek decided to wipe out his communist allies in 1927, he began 20 years of fighting. After the Nationalists' victory over the warlords in 1928, Chiang then turned his attention to the communists. In a series of extermination campaigns, he tried to eradicate the bases or Soviets that were under communist control, and by 1934 it seemed he had finally succeeded. The main Soviet in Jiangxi was surrounded by 800,000 nationalists, and all seemed hopeless. Then the communists broke out and began the epic Long March, which would cover some 3,000 miles to a new base in Shenzi province, from where they would continue their fighting. Warfare between the nationalists and the communists continued even when the Japanese began their incursions into Chinese territory. The nationalists were accused of being more concerned with defeating communists than fighting the Japanese, although some nationalist officers were unhappy with this tactic. This unhappiness with Chiang's policy of attacking the communists rather than facing up to the invading Japanese came to a head in the famous Shanxi incident of 1936. Chiang was visiting some of his soldiers in Shanxi province because he had refused to attack the communists when he was kidnapped by the young Marshal Chiang Shiyuan. Chiang was forced to agree to form a united front with the communists to fight Japanese. This uneasy alliance held until 1941, when the nationalists attacked a communist unit, the new Fourth Army, which was under nationalist command. After this incident, any pretense of cooperation ended, and for the next few years neither side made any real effort to fight the Japanese on a large scale. They were but preparing for the civil war they believed would follow an Allied victory over Japan. The end of World War II, in August 1945, started a period of false peace, with attempts at talks failing. Both the nationalists and the communists were now spoiling for a fight, and the fight began in earnest in 1946. The Communist Army Communist Army began life in August 1927, following the mutiny of the Nationalist 4th Division under its commander Chuti, the first proper military unit of the Communist Party. It joined forces with another revolutionary, Mao Zedong, and his band of guerrillas to help come the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. For the next 10 years the Red Army battled against the Nationalists, until 1937, when the Japanese invaded China on a massive scale. It then formed an uneasy alliance with the Nationalists against Japan, the United Front, and put its two main armies, the 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army, under nationalist control. This alliance broke down in 1941 following the nationalist attack on the new 4th Army. Their army then spent the next few years fighting the Japanese independently, notably in the 100 Regiments campaign, when it suffered heavy losses. For the next few years, the Communist forces licked their wounds and prepared themselves for the inevitable conflict with the Nationalists. With the new title of China's People's Liberation Army, it began the Civil War in 1946, having learned some hard lessons. Communist uniforms 19-7 for H. Early Communist fighters would either have worn civilian dress or uniforms captured from the Warlord armies or the Nationalists. Shortage of good equipment in general was to be a problem for the Communists for the whole of the period of conflict. As they established buses and Soviets, they were able to manufacture the simple cotton uniforms in small workshops. The Communists were not too interested in the smart appearance of their soldiers, and a typical Communist fighter of the 1920s and 1930s would often have been dressed in quasi-civilian dress. Early attempts to produce a unique uniform gave soldiers patchwork-type uniforms with large red stars sewn on homemade caps. Different combinations of cotton shirts, jackets, puttees, and field caps would have been worn, with homemade shoes or sandals, and homemade canvas bandoliers. Communist fighters could not be choosy about what they wore. They took anything available from their own sources or the enemy's. Even the highest-ranking officers wore the same uniform as a private, and if any insignia at all was worn, it was usually the red star on the cap and red collar patches of the plainest design. No rank system existed in the Communist forces of the 1920s and 1930s, since their political beliefs meant that all soldiers were equal. They did have positional titles, see Table 5, but these were not indicated by any rank markings. It was only when the Communists fought with the Nationalists in the United Front against Japan that rank insignia was worn, and this was of the Nationalist type. The two armies of the Communist forces under the command of the Nationalists during the United Front were the new Fourth Army, which was made up of various Communist units from East China, and the Eighth Route Army from Shenzi. These armies wore nationalist uniforms and were officially units of Nationalist Army, even after the ending of the alliance with the Nationalists in 1941. Soldiers of these units wore our enemy's uniforms. The commander-in-chief of the Red Army, Shoot, was seen as late as 1946 wearing the Nationalist Sun badge, but this was for the benefit of the U.S. General Marshal, who was trying to broker peace in China at that time. Puppet Armies. Term puppet army is used here to describe the armies of the various regimes set up by Japan as part of their plan to control most of China. As the Japanese took more and more territory, they realized that they needed some form of client states that would control parts of China for them but remain under the command of Japanese masters. The different Japanese armies worked independently of each other and of the government in Tokyo, and they each set up rival regimes in the area that their army garrisoned. These puppet armies were at first kept small, but as the war dragged on and more Japanese troops were withdrawn to fight in the Pacific, the Japanese needed more manpower and the puppet armies began to grow in size. Although vast in numbers by the end of the year, they were never considered much of a threat either by the Communists or the Nationalists, and were a good supply of weapons and recruits. Manchukuo. Japanese invasion of the Chinese province of Manchuria in 1931 was their first step in their planned conquest of all China. They had already asked the last emperor of China, Henry Puyi, who was in exile, if he would become the head of this new state as chief executive. He had agreed, hoping it would be a stepping stone to becoming emperor of the new empire of Manchukuo, as Manchuria was renamed. In 1934 he got this wish when he was made emperor of Manchukuo. His further ambitions to become emperor of all China once again were not to be fulfilled. The Japanese only wanted him as puppet emperor under their firm control. Until the Russians invaded in 1945, Manchukuo was a satellite state of Japan, with its own army, navy and air force, and with all orders coming from the Japanese high command. The Manchukuo army of Manchukuo should be dealt with separately from the rest of puppet armies because the Japanese did intend this army to be an independent one, albeit firmly under their control. Set up in 1932, shortly after the Japanese conquest of Manchuria, it was originally made up of former soldiers of the Northern Chinese Army. In the early 1930s it reached a strength of about 70,000, but by the 1940s Allied intelligence reports estimated a possible strength of 500,000. This is almost certainly an exaggeration. The figure was probably more like 200,000. The Manchukuo army was used largely for bandit suppression, often with Japanese officers in charge of operations. If properly led, the Manchukuo army could perform well in this role. When assessing the combat effectiveness of puppet troops, it should always be remembered that most soldiers of puppet armies fought for food and the uniform on their backs, not the glory of their regime, and certainly not for the Japanese uniform of the Manchukuo army. In the early days of the state of Manchukuo, the soldiers of its army wore the uniform of their former employer, the young marshal. The only difference in dress between the Manchukuo army and their foes, the Nationalist Northern Army, was that the Manchukuo army wore yellow armbands and the Nationalist troops wore red. The basic uniform at that time would have been light green color, with the new cap badge in the shape of aster divided into 5 colors: red, blue, black, white, and yellow. New dress regulations were introduced throughout the 1930s, and by 1939 the Manchukuo army had a distinctive uniform. The collar was Japanese khaki and the style was similar to the Japanese model. 3 types of headgear were worn: a forage cap, which was similar to the Japanese semetal but with a flatter crown, a peaked cap, and a fur hat for winter service. The Japanese 1930 model helmet was also worn in limited numbers in the fighting on the border with Mongolia in 1939. Ranks were indicated by its same system of stars and stripes on the shoulder bars as in the Warlord armies of the 1920s, but the highest-ranking general had, in addition to 3 stars, an orchid blossom on the end of the shoulder bar nearest the collar. Before 1937, shoulder bars were in the branch color, the same as on the collar insignia. After that date, the collars stayed in the branch color, but all shoulder bars became maroon for all branches. White Russians in the Manchukuo army. A meager White Russians served in the Manchukuo army in the 1930s and 1940s, first individually and then as whole units. In 1932, 2 small units were formed under General Kaunio, each about 200 men strong. The Sano Brigade, formed in 1938, was stronger, at 700 men, and was supposed to be trained to operate behind Soviet lines. By 1945 there were about 4,000 men on the rolls of this Sano Brigade involved in sabotage training. Uniforms worn by the White Russians were the same as in the rest of the Manchukuo army, but 1 unit was seen wearing side caps not worn by the rest of the army. Other puppet troops. When the Japanese invaded China on a large scale in 1937, they soon set up puppet regimes through which they hoped to control vast parts of the country. These regimes in turn were made to enlist puppet armies to help the Japanese fight the guerrillas that continued to resist the invaders. The main armies involved were those of the Provisional Government in Peking, set up in 1937, the Reformed Government in Nanjing, set up in 1938, and the Inner Mongolian regime, set up in 1935. The Provisional Government Army was 41,000 strong, their Formed Government Army 30,000 strong, and the Inner Mongolian forces up to 18,000. These armies were employed on guard duties and were never equipped to a good standard. Certainly they were never given heavy equipment such as artillery. The Japanese didn't trust them and often only gave them a few rounds of ammunition each, in case they went over to the guerrillas. In 1940 all the puppet regimes were united under one government under Yuan Qingwei, and all armies were joined together. By 1945 Allied intelligence estimated that about 900,000 men were in puppet armies of one sort or another, either in the regular army or in local militia. So although of poor quality and with little combat effectiveness, their sheer size means that they must have been of significance to the Japanese war machine. Uniforms of puppet armies. Uniforms of the puppet armies were as diverse as armies themselves, with a motley assortment of dress. Some troops that had come over from Nationalist side wore their old uniforms with old insignia removed. Others were issued with simple cotton uniforms and Japanese caps with new insignia added, while many were simply given surplus Japanese uniforms with the Japanese insignia taken off. The PUPPT regimes did not invent new insignia and flags for their armies on a large scale. What new badges were used were based on the old Republican flag from the 1911 to 28 period. The 5-colored star was used by the first puppet regime, the East Hope Autonomous Anti-Communist Government, set up in 1935, and by the Provisional Government set up in Peking in 1937. The Reformed Government established in Nanjing in 1938 used the same flag as the 2 earlier regimes, and a cap badge based on the flag but of a slightly different design. The badge used the same color, but each of the 5 colors was the petal of a 5-colored flower. In 1940, when the Yuan Qingwei regime took over, uniforms were issued that were identical to Nationalist ones in every detail. This was because the Wang regime claimed to be the true nationalist government of China, so they wanted their army to look the part. Wang Qinghui's general's uniform had one distinctive feature: a small nationalist sun emblem at the front of his gold-collared patch, alongside three gold triangles that denoted his rank. The Wang Qinghui regime even used the same flag as the nationalist government, with the addition of a small yellow pennant which carried an inscription which told of the anti-communist nature of the regime. This pennant was added at the insistence of the Japanese. All the puppet regimes were desperately short of money. The only form of revenue came from tariffs charged on smuggled goods. This meant that there was little or no money available to clothe and equip the armies, so anything they could get from the Japanese or from captured nationalist stocks was put to use. The Civil War, 1945 for He nationalists and communists had unfinished business after World War II, and although attempts were made to settle their disputes peacefully, fighting soon broke out all over China. Chiang Kai-shek was determined to control all China, so he advanced into the communist stronghold of Manchuria, and it was there that the decisive battles of the Civil War were fought. During the Sino-Japanese War, the nationalists had lost not only their best soldiers but, more importantly, their best officers. This lack of good officers resulted in poor tactics and cost the nationalists the Civil War. The nationalists took cities and held them but were gradually surrounded by communists in the countryside. Cities became virtual prison camps for the nationalists as the communists took stronghold after stronghold. Chiang Kai-shek insisted right up to the end of the war on giving the cream of the equipment to his most loyal divisions, thus weakening most of his army. Some of his most able commanders were not trusted by Chiang, so their units received little of the American equipment that was being supplied in large quantities. It was attitudes like this that severely weakened the nationalist war effort and helped the communists, who were united in their aims. At the beginning of the Civil War, the nationalists had overwhelming superiority in men and equipment, but by 1949 the pendulum had swung the other way, and the communists had overtaken them. The Civil War wasn't all one-sided, and the communists did face many setbacks, but it soon became a matter of when and not if the nationalists will be defeated. In September 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and hundreds of thousands of supporters left the mainland and set up a government on Taiwan. Mao Zedong declared the foundation of the People's Republic of China in October, ending 40 years of fighting for control of China. Nationalist uniforms in the Civil War. When full-scale civil war between the nationalists and the communists broke out in 1946, new uniforms were introduced on the nationalist side. The new officer's uniform consisted of a U.S.-style khaki-peaked cap with a cap badge which had the old sun emblem surrounded by a wreath. The green khaki service tunic had a rounded collar with new branch badges replacing the old brand colors. The new branch badges were as follows: infantry crossed rifles, artillery cannon on wheels, cavalry crossed swords, staff crossed batons, signals crossed flags, quartermasters a wheel, tank troops a tank, engineers a castle, and military police crossed pistols. Many of the nationalist soldiers still wore the old-style uniforms from 1937 to 45, but with more American equipment such as belts and boots. As the Civil War drew to a close, a new padded gray cotton uniform was in service, similar to the old winter-issue uniform but smarter in appearance. The hat had ear flaps as in the old uniform but without the fur lining and with cutouts for the ears so the ears were protected when flaps were worn down. USML steel helmets were also worn during the Civil War, particularly by the American trained divisions that had been set up in India during World War II, and were airlifted back to China by the Americans at the end of the war. The Americans were supplying more and more equipment and uniforms, but these often didn't reach frontline troops due to bad organization or corruption.